Yes? Yeah. Hello, welcome everybody. My name is Adriek van Nieuwhuis. I'm head of industry at IDFA. And it's a pleasure to welcome you on behalf of Southern Vision, the Netherlands, and IDFA at this talk, Who Owns History? The Politics of Memory Preservation. As many of you might know, we have a program which is dealing with archival films. Films which are based totally on archival footage. The title of the program is Re-Releasing History. And of course, while we were making this program, our programmers started to have many questions, because if you dive into this world of archival films, and filmmakers who are working with the archival footage, then lots of questions come up. Questions like who is telling which story and what material we use, and why do we make all these choices we are making. So it's my pleasure to welcome all these guests who worked. Part of them worked with archival footage as a filmmaker, others are working in the archives themselves. I leave the introduction of the panel, the beautiful panel, to our wonderful moderator of this morning, Givanni. Please give them a warm hand.
Hello, everyone. I'm June Givanni. I run the June Givanni Pan-African Cinema Archive. I'm based in London. It's an archive that's based on 35 years of curating Pan-African cinema. And I'm very glad to have been invited to be part of this illustrious gathering here today and to discuss some quite important questions that are close to, I think, all of our hearts, and in terms of what we do as professionals in the industry. I will introduce the panelists as we go a bit later, but I would just like, so that you know who's who, to say that next to me is Ruurd Blom. Next to him is Susana de Sousa Dias. Then there's David Shields, and then there's Sandra Beerends. And over there is Shaheen Merali. And as I say, I'll introduce them as we come into the discussion. Just an idea that about the structure of this session. It'll be in two parts. We'll first be doing a series of short interviews with the three featured filmmakers whose work IDFA has programmed for this section. And that will be followed by a broader discussion where the two archivists will join the discussion to reflect on some critical issues that are related to the creative use of historic footage, such as questions of appropriation, ethics, ownership, and responsibility, both from a filmmaker's point of view and as well from a curatorial or archival perspective. I'd like, first of all, though, to maybe just make a few comments from my own perspective about what it is we're doing, and a couple of things that I think are useful to share with you. I see documentary film as a medium which has traditionally been seen as factual and objective, but with the development of the genre, technology, and the expansion of how documentaries are shaped and presented, by whom and for whom, these assumptions are no longer as easily relevant. Similarly, archives, by nature of the immediacy of the image and the assumed visual reality that is being presented, they were also often regarded as being objective and factual, in essence. But in fact, both documentaries and archives are highly selective and subjective. So what does that mean for the documentary product that uses archive? Of course, the purpose is one of communication, but in visual and artistic forms, how that is achieved will depend on the primary purpose of the film and the filmmaker, the creation of an artistic product, or the communication or exploration of a historic moment or a historic phenomena. I suppose we could also look at documentary products using archive as including an assumption that because we live in the 21st century and we're looking at, or audiences could be looking at, archival material from another era or from another society or from another part of the world, that might be viewed, that the material that might be viewed as problematic for one reason or another, automatically there's an assumption that the reworking of that material for new eyes means that the new film isn't problematic, or that filmmakers and their audiences are bringing a reformed or informed perspective to the archive images in their reworked form or context. But of course, in reality, both the original material, archive material, in its use in the film are subjective. Sorry, I'll say that again. But of course, both the original material and its use in the new film are subjective and can and have been used in some cases to denigrate. So there is no inbuilt altruistic, altruistic notion of the documentary genre or of the archives. Both are subjective. That is why we have to reflect on and discuss these questions. So that's what I'd like to say by way of a quick intro, and I think we should move straight away to presenting the films and the filmmakers. I would like to start with David Shields. His film showed yesterday. It's Marshawn Lynch, a history. And David is an author for 22 best-selling books he has under his belt. And this film, the film that he showed yesterday, is his first major film credit. And it's very loosely inspired by the book Black Planet, Facing Race, during an NBA season. It documents and celebrates Lynch's attempt to be true to himself in a capitalist, racist society that wants to exploit him and that he wants to both exploit and oppose. Lynch is leaving a legacy of the eloquence of silence, echo, and mimicry as key tools of defiance. I think what I would like to ask you, David, and in fact what we will do is I will ask each of you in turn to first of all introduce your film and to show your clip, and then I will ask you a couple of questions. So, first of all, okay, you don't want to say anything first. You prefer to? Yes, if you.
Yeah, the film. Do you want me to spend 3 minutes, 5?
No,
10?
no. Just very quick to introduce.
Very briefly.
Yes.
Yeah, the movie's called Marshawn Lynch: A History. I feel like you summarized it beautifully. In a way, there's a wonderful quote by the French writer Albert Camus, who said, "The only way to deal with an unjust society is to be so absolutely free that your very existence is an act of rebellion." It's an awfully good summary of what I admired about Marshawn Lynch, is his attempt to be free. Obviously, no one is completely free, but the movie's a kind of love song to Marshawn Lynch's quixotic attempt to be free in a very difficult realm to be free in. So on that brief prologue, I guess, we'll show the movie.
Okay, can I just say, you don't want to say anything more about who he was? I haven't seen the clip you're going to show.
Sure.
So
yeah, I think
if you want to say.
The clip, I don't know, I mean, I live in the US in Los Angeles and Seattle, and Marshawn Lynch is an American football player who played for the Seattle Seahawks. I don't know if any of you even know who he is, but he over many years developed a strategy of not speaking to the American sports media, either answering in very cryptic non-answers or repeating the questions or literally not speaking. And he was generally perceived to be either extremely shy or petulant or bored or something. And as someone myself who grew up near where Marshawn grew up in the Bay Area in California, I grew up in a very political family. As a child, I had a very severe stutter and knew that often when someone's silent or self-imposed silence can often hide or disguise immense amounts of eloquence and fury. I just felt very instinctively from the beginning that Marshawn Lynch's silence had a deeply political and cultural undertow to it. So over 4 years, I made a film tracking him from his birth and growing up in Oakland. In a way, the silence was born in Oakland, a deeply political city. That silence was deepened in Buffalo, New York. It went viral in Seattle, got deeply politicized through Colin Kaepernick and Donald Trump. And then I think in many ways that silence was handed off as legacy to the next generation of African American athletes.
Great. Thank you. Should we have the clip
perhaps
now? Thank you.
We'll show the clip now.
What can you say about how you guys battled, especially with the pressure they were bringing up front in the third quarter to really break through with the runs you had?
I'm thankful.
Talk about your performance in the second half, the big run.
I'm thankful.
Marshawn, can you tell us a little bit about the team approach to this game?
I'm thankful.
When's your next charity event?
I'm thankful.
Marshawn, talk about the celebration dance at the Cam Chancellor's touchdown. What was the song of the day on the way to the game, Marshawn?
I'm thankful.
Thank you. I want to ask, because this footage, this film uses all the way through a whole collage of images, of media images, of Marshawn and the whole period that you're looking at. And I think it's a question that is something that I'll ask each of you filmmakers, because I wondered how do you navigate the archive when the meanings assigned to images or their indexing might differ from the perspective that you have on those materials. For instance, what is it that your film brings to all of that media footage that prevents it from being a repetition of the original problem? So that's one of the things I'd like to ask.
Yeah, I don't know if you want me to answer or for everyone to answer for themselves, but I think you frame the question beautifully.
I'll ask the others in a different way when I get to them.
No, you frame the question beautifully and powerfully, that I often question myself how I, as a white filmmaker, especially after Black Lives Matter, but even the whole history of America over 400 years, how did I have the right to make a film about a black athlete? And I certainly questioned that constantly. And throughout the film, I make gestures, I hope, of self-questioning. I was haunted throughout by this line by Alice Walker, the American novelist, who was asked once, what can American white men do to contribute? And she said, just shut up and listen for the next 350 years. Which is quite a powerful rejoinder, and I felt that was absolutely crucial to me. I wanted, in many ways, to just shut up and listen to Marshawn Lynch shutting up and saying nothing. So the film has no overt commentary by me. Obviously, in every juxtaposition, I'm making a lot of cultural and political meaning, but it was extremely important to me to not have some omniscient voice, some Ken Burns mission control voice imposing some kind of culturally dominant meaning upon the film. That we always told ourselves never to make the film feel like that you're watching television, feel like that you are trapped inside of Marshawn Lynch's football helmet as he zigs and zags and reverses and speeds forward and stops and pivots, so the film feels as if you are watching a Marshawn Lynch run from inside of Marshawn's helmet.
So what was his response to the film?
Well, we showed the film in Oakland, his hometown, and he had a brilliant cryptic response to the film. Marshawn came up to me after the film, and he said, I wanted to hate on you, but I couldn't because you did a damn good job with it. Which I thought that captured, again, I don't mean to impose my paraphrase on his eloquently cryptic comment, but I feel like that really captured all three aspects of it. How dare you make this film without my direct participation? But I couldn't, that is to say, I actually watched the film several times. We sent him the Vimeo link to make sure that he was okay with it. But you did a damn good job with it. I mean, there's any number of ways of interpreting that, but I felt like it was a sense of saying that he didn't feel violated by my attempt. I mean, there's any number of ways to question what I did as having all the very problems that June mentioned. And I just kept on wanting to contribute to the conversation, especially in American culture, about white violence being done to black bodies. And obviously there's a possibility that the film would be an example of the very things it was trying to criticize. But I felt like if only black people were contributing to Black Lives Matter, how can the conversation expand? How can progress be made? And I was willing to take that particular chance. You know, I'm always haunted by this idea of, you know, the only rule is never be boring. And I wanted to make an interesting film, and if it bruised some egos, so be it.
Okay, thank you very much for that. So I take it from that there was very little interaction between you for the making of this film?
That we asked him and his representatives throughout, would you like to participate? And their response was, straight out of Bartleby, the Scrivener, the great Herman Melville novella, I would prefer not to, that he was constantly saying that we won't participate, but we won't block the film either.
Okay.
And that was their response throughout.
Thank you, David. Of course, we're coming back to all of this as we go through. I'll move to Susanna, if I may. Susanna's film is still live, and Susana de Sousa Dias. She comes with an MPhil in aesthetics and philosophy of art, with a dissertation in cinema, archive and memory that accompanied the making of her first long essay documentary, Natureza Morta, Still Life. That's this film. She was a member of the board of the Portuguese Documentary Association, and also one of the most notorious aspects of her work is the artistic integration of archival footage dating from the Portuguese dictatorship. And some of it we do see in this film. So, Susanna, what for you were the... I'm going to ask you first of all to do a short introduction about the film and to show your clip, and then we can talk a bit about it.
Okay, so my film was made more or less 14 years ago, actually, and it is a film entirely made of archive footage, shot during the times of the Portuguese dictatorship. That was a dictatorship that lasted for 48 years. And I decided, I'm going to explain very briefly why I decided to do this film, and actually it opened up my work as a researcher and in the archives, and yeah. So my film, I enter in the archive of the political police in Portugal and in the army archive, and I was very impressed with the images and with the criminal cases I read there, but especially the images were very, very impressive. So I decided to work to present a story of the dictatorship only through archive images. And this was the purpose of the film, because I didn't want to show the images with the pressure of words, so I decided to don't write a text and just present the images. And the problem was that I only had archive footage produced by the dictatorship itself. So this was a huge problem I had. So the idea of the film was to turn the images, to open them up so that you can see things that the dictatorship didn't want us to see. So I can say that all my work in archives, it's an attempt to build a kind of counter-archive of what the Portuguese dictatorship did want to show, and of things actually that we cannot find in the archives. And for me, this is one problem of the archives, because when usually we think, okay, we are going to an archive and things are there. No, they are not there. And in the political archive, in the archive of the political police, what we have are the discursive productions of the police itself. So we cannot rely in that archive. So we have to try to discover more from inside the archive and outside. So this film is a 72 minutes long film, but actually I only used 12 minutes of archive footage, and I had I tried to find the most a fair form, I can say this in English, to present these images. And for me it was very important, a thing that I called decelerated movement, that it's more than a slow motion, because slow motion is just a plain effect. When we think about using slow motion and this idea of decelerated movement as another intention, you can use it as a kind of entity in itself. But this is, okay, so I'm going to present. What you are going to see, it's a little bit of how can I say? I expose the methods. So you are going to see one very short shot that I will repeat. It's not in the film. And then we are going to see how I work this shot in the film. And this is the reason why the film has only 12 minutes of archive footage and it lasts 72 minutes.
Great.
That's very okay. So the first clip, please.
Oh, I'm sorry. I thought you were going to show some other clips.
I know,
That's
I
right.
have another one, but
Yeah.
yeah, it's from another film. So if it came, it's because of the
Okay, we
process.
can maybe use it later
yeah.
in the discussion.
Yeah.
Okay. But that clip was from the film, because I've seen that. So I think you've most probably covered a number of the things that I was going to ask, because it was to do with, as I mentioned before, how you navigate the archive when the meanings assigned to the images and their indexing might differ from your own perspective on these materials. And in particular, the ethical questions that you had to take into account in interpreting and contextualizing the archive image that you used. Because things that I noted in there, of course, was the colonial derision, the ridicule, the horrors of mutilated corpses, things like that. And when you weigh up the pros and the cons, and what are your thoughts and arguments and your own internal conversations that lead you to decide that it's important to include these images, and how it serves the main purpose of the narrative of your film.
Actually, this was the film took me 3 years to do, and I was confronted with the ethical problem, of course, and the how I had lots of questions. I mean, how can I deal with the archive footage? How can history be told through film? This is another question that it was very important for me, and these are very delicate materials, but these are things that the dictatorship tried to hide. So for me it was paramount to show that people died. Because in Portugal, there are kind of bleaching of the dictatorship and of the memory of the dictatorship. And people used to say, okay, it was a very soft dictatorship. It was not. It was very violent, and especially it was violent in the African countries. And nobody talks about it. And actually, I made a film afterwards, and about the political prisoners. And I decided to go to shoot. It's only made also with archive images, mugshots only, still mugshots. And I decided to go to Mozambique to interview former political prisoners. And one Portuguese historian told me, "Why are you going to Mozambique? It's not part of the history. You have to deal with the Portuguese prisoners." And I said, "Come on, the political police it's extremely violent. They kill lots of people there, so it's not possible to erase this aspect of the Portuguese dictatorship." So for me, it was really paramount to show these images. And of course that, for me, the most important thing was to try to present a story, as I told, of a possible story of the Portuguese dictatorship through these images that are not the images that people are used to see, but using images that were in the rushes sometimes, so not the biggest representations of the regime. And the interesting thing here was that I had to question myself, how can history be told? Yeah, and this for me it's very important, because form, and for me it's a kind of premise to all my films. Form always forms the content. Form always shapes the content. So form and content are not separated things as traditional ways of thinking used to say. So form shapes the content. And how can we approach the past? For me, this was a very important thing. And actually, I have to say that Walter Benjamin was a very important author for me. And you talk about objectivity and factuality. And actually, what is the past? There are no objective pasts, objective facts from the past. It's always facts of memory. We build the facts, the historical facts. So when we start to work with images, these are representations. So my idea was to go inside those images to see what things escaped to the control of the regime. So this was the main purpose. Yes. The main purpose of the film. Yeah. And of course, just to say one thing, because as the film has no words and mainly is propaganda images, it was very difficult because suddenly the images start to present the original program. Yeah. And this is were the most challenging in the film.
Well, this is it, because of course you're trying not to represent the same argument, but without a narrative.
Because one of the risks when we use archive footage is that we are using, we are perpetuating the same representations, and it's not possible. And we see this every day.
Yes. It's something that we will come back to again as we go through. Thank you, Susanna. Sandra Beerends. Okay. Sandra Beerends, the director of a new film that's going to be shown this evening, and I hope you're all going to see it. I'm looking forward to seeing it again. I have seen it, of course. Sandra Beerends is known primarily as first of all, as a script editor, but also as a filmmaker, script editor, creative producer, writer, and director. And she has worked. And do you still work for the Dutch broadcaster NTR? Okay, and she runs her own company, Beruang. And They Called Me Babu is a film that you started a couple of years ago, and it's just 5 years ago. Okay. And it's just now going to be launched. So would you like to say something about the film and show your clips?
Yeah, because did you choose? Because hi everybody.
You can choose. You can do the
Okay,
first two, or yes,
well,
I think maybe just the first two.
The first two?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, you asked the other ones, so maybe I give an answer on that. Why I started it like this. My mom is from Indonesia, and I have a Dutch father. And as people know, Indonesia was for a long time a colony of the Netherlands. And my mom told me a lot about it, mostly nice stories. And she told me about her babu. It was an Indonesian nanny. And when I grow older, a lot of people that had their youth there, they had Indonesian nannies. And they were always talking about, in a very emotional way, and after the war, they didn't see her. And I was like, you know, I heard a lot about babus, but I don't see films about babus, I don't see books about babus, so where are they? So I knew that the Dutch people who were there in the colony, they make their own home movies to send home, and so everybody can see how wonderful life we have in this paradise. We have like 10 servants, and it's wonderful and beautiful weather. And so I thought there must be something there, and I started in because I know there is a huge archive of home material. And I was looking, but there was not like a topic babu. There was like servants or something like that. And I was looking at it, and well, then I thought, maybe there is something there, because mostly these films were made by white Dutch fathers, and they're mostly interested in their own child. So the focus was always on their child. And sometimes I see a hand like this, or just, you know, a scarf behind. Maybe that was her. And then I turned back, and then there was a kid trying to set his first steps, and then I saw something in the bushes, and I thought, maybe that's the babu. So then I went on, and I was going to, with Dorrit Schotenmaier, who's here as well, from and then I said, yeah, I think there must be more, but it's all in your cellars. Can we go to the basement and look at it? And then I found a family that also focused on the babu, because most of the times, the moment the child was walking, they were just following the child and not the babu anymore. So then I was very intrigued to find a way to tell their stories, because it was obviously that all the people that were raised by the babus were very emotional about them, and they think about them as like a first mother or at least a second mother, but there was nothing of them, so they were in the shadow in a way. So I don't know, I felt the urge to tell their story. And then I did a lot of research, and I found, I interviewed babus in Indonesia, but there were also some very good anthropological research, and I asked a lot of former babus about their stories, and I used all these testimonies to try to tell one story. And so I was searching on in and also in Beeld en Geluid, who's here as well, and at the NHK from Japanese archives, to look for archive material, but always the center for me was that I wanted to tell the story from her point of view. So it always has to be her living world and her way of looking at it. Mm-hmm. And it means that material that was made for a totally other purpose, like the Dutch people see how great we have it here. I give her a voice, so I use the voiceover. And so she's commenting in a way everything we see, so she's the guide in this whole film. Mm-hmm. And I try not I try to look at both sides, because I'm in the middle. I have like both backgrounds, and so I felt, because in this period that she was a nanny, for a lot of nannies, they felt like in between. They felt like they're kind of a family, but they're not. And because of the political situation, you know, they forced to choose, or other people choose for her. You're Indonesian, you're an enemy, or you're not an enemy. And so she's trying to find her own way.
Right. Okay, I think we will use just maybe the first clip. Just
of the Japanese
for time.
propaganda, yes?
The first clip that we showed.
Okay.
Yes, yes.
Maybe I tell, no.
Okay.
Tapi apa saja yang bukan Jepang sekarang dilarang. Bolehkah punya pikiran dalam bahasa yang dilarang? Boleh punya ingatan dengan kata-kata dilarang? Bolehkah punya keinginan akan huruf-huruf yang dilarang?
Thank you. Just one thing, because of course you've reconstructed the person and it's her narrative that we hear. And I thought that it's been said that an archive is not a form of consciousness, but it's a form of being. The archive is not a form of, an archive is not a form of consciousness, it's a form of being. And so as an artist working with archive, you're reconfiguring that being that's embedded in the archival text. So this is where the re-narrativization happens, right? So, but in your work, the re-narrativization is very literal, because you create a narrative from some of the voice narratives of others. And so please tell us about your decision and whether there are any ethical questions in doing that, where you're bringing together a number of other stories into creating this one particular story as an example of a number of different lived experiences.
This is very, maybe this is very lyrical, and there are also I use a lot of anecdotes, so they were really like how they felt. But it is based on the feelings that are heard from the Babus and that are read. So the thing was, in the film, she was for 1 year, she was in the Netherlands, and so she was very proud that she was a very intelligent woman. And that is also based on the thing, you don't see it here, but I have fragments from one family that are really focusing on their Babu as well. And I researched and I found the girl in this film. Oh. And she really talked about her Babu. And she was a very intelligent woman, and she was here for 1 year, and she was friends with the housekeeper. And so when they came back, she was able to learn to speak and to write Dutch. And so she read a lot aloud before sleeping. So this started just before. She said also that, you know, I can just take Pinkeltje, or a book that I can that I read all the time. And then when the Japanese, this is about the Japanese occupation, and then so all her family is going into the camps, and she has no work and no house, and she really misses the child she's working for. And then, but it's also forbidden to speak Dutch, obviously, but also Indonesian. So it is really about from one day to the other that people say, okay, now we're the boss, and you're not even allowed to think in your own language. So, and I heard that a lot from the Indonesian people, that, you know, they were like, okay. And the thing is that the material is made for propaganda use, like, you know, the Indonesian people, they really like to sing Japanese songs, and they really like our discipline. And if you look at the faces, they're very, very sad. And my translator, who's from Indonesia, she had to cry when she saw this this fragment. Said, I see my mother, you know, I know all her stories, that she was there, and, you know, she has to smile and things like that, but it was not nice at all.
Yes, yes. So,
yes. Well, I kind of make a character of all the stories of Babus I heard. And so because for me the most important was that I want to feel her loyalty conflict. You know, she's in between. And the strange thing was that when all the people, the Dutch people had to go into the camps, well, she was outside because she was Indonesian, and she wanted to help them, and there were a lot of stories about it, trying to bring some playthings or some clothes, and then the Japanese said, but hold on, are you with this Dutch family? You're our enemy. So it was very frightened for her. And then after 3 years, the capitulation of Japan was there, and so a lot of Babus, and not to, I don't want to idealize the colonial time, but for a lot of poor people, the Dutch time, as they call it, it was at least a time of rest. So a lot of Indonesian nannies thought, okay, so when the war is over, we have our work back, and we can again work with this family. So they came to the camps, but on that time, the Indonesian vrijheidsstrijders fighting for their independence, they were also attacking Dutch people. So the Dutch people had to stay in the camps, and then the Japanese are protecting them. Yeah. So when they came there, they said, oh, but you're Indonesian, so you're the enemy of the Dutch. And it was so confusing, and for me it was really, I really want to tell their story, like, you know, in between, and everybody's accusing her, and it's just, for me, it was only about the human relationship.
Right. I think that's a discussion. Yes, thank you. I think it's a discussion that you will definitely have after the screening of the film. It's, you know, all of these films are really important. I would encourage you all, if you haven't seen them and your people haven't seen yet, to definitely see them. And we will be coming back to these films and to your commentary. One of the things we haven't talked about is how you got the archive and where the archive came from. So we'll discuss that. We just want to move into the discussion with the archivists that are here as well. So we have next to me Ruurd Blom, who works at the Netherlands Institute of Sound and Vision, media manager for Collection Access. He works on the online accessibility of collection material, and in the context of that work, Ruurd was responsible for the opening up of a controversial visual archive that he might wish to speak about in the course of our discussion on ethics and access. And I'm sure it's going to come up.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, last year, shall I talk?
Well, I just wanted to introduce Shaheen as well, and then there were a couple of questions. That particular one we'll come back to shortly. Okay. Shaheen Merali is both a curator, artist and writer, currently based in London and Berlin, where from 2003 to 2008, he was head of exhibitions, film and new media at the Haus der Kultur und der Welt in Berlin. He's had many significant roles at the University of the Arts in London and the University of Westminster. But most significantly for us here, we're interested that he co-founded the Panchayat Arts Education Resource Unit in East London. It's an archive that specifically addresses the needs and issues of non-European artists and cultural producers. And just to give a little bit of background, can I ask you both about whether your archives own the intellectual property for the materials in your collections, and have the filmmakers and artists given you the rights to decide what happens to it and how it might be used, and how do you take that responsibility? It's just so that we get a sense of these archives and how they work. We'll come back to the ethical questions shortly. Sorry.
Well, yeah, we have a huge archive that goes back to 1900 or so. It's the Dutch Public Broadcast Archive, so it originated from films and radio material, and now we have all sorts of collection areas like the new ones, web video and websites, and we have this collection. It's made up by the public broadcasting companies in Holland, so in a sense we all paid for it by paying taxes, and these programs were made. But of course there are copyrights, so we cannot do with it what we want, because people made it and put effort into this. But we have this really big collection. It goes way back in time. So if you take part of the collection which might be in the public domain, or which is not in the public domain yet, but we can sometimes use a Creative Commons license, to not have to wait these 70 years before copyright expires. And well, that is a big thing, because we have this huge collection, but we can only show a bit of it online because of these copyrights. So that is quite a thing, because we want to show more, but we can't for the copyright issues. But we put some effort in making our collection available online as much as we can. When it's public domain, there are no copyrights left, so let's put it online and make it available. And we use Wikimedia as well to make this world known, and to spread it, and to put it on an open platform that will not be filtered by, well, the way, for instance, YouTube does it. It does not give insights in why material is taken offline, and it's really intransparent. So in doing this, we try to work together with Wikimedia and Wikipedia to make it bigger, and to make it known, and to provide context with this material, because yeah, some collections, well, they tell about themselves, but some collections, like we did last year, from the National Socialist Movement, these are films from 1941 to 1944, made by this movement in Holland, while Holland was under occupation. And this is a really sensitive part of Dutch history, so to say, and we're not proud of it, but it happened, and we did this together with Netherlands Institute of War Documentation and Holocaust Studies here in Amsterdam. And they had this project. They were working on this photo collection of the National Socialist movement. About 800 photos. They had a photo service and a film service. And we had these films in our archives, confiscated war movies. And together we did this project. We thought it's important to tell the story like it is and use the authentic material, even though we're not proud of it. We have to make this available, open online, so people can learn, can encounter it, can watch it, can see it for themselves, and make it possible that enable the storytelling with this actual material.
So there are no issues around its misuse?
No, we have not had that. Of course, we thought about this. Should we do this? Are we part of making this collection there? And well, we don't want to. It's about spreading history, about telling what happened, and it's not about that we are in front of these ideas that were made. It's sort of a fake news period, and you have to see it in the time that this material was made in World War II when Holland was under occupation. So it was a real different time, and yeah, when you take a look at these movies, you have to put them in the time when they were made. And yeah, this was a special project for us, and we thought we would have some negative news about this, but it was foremost positive news, because people said, wow, it's quite something. It's good that you have done this, even though you might get some oppression or some wind against you.
I suppose what I'm getting at is what I said earlier on as well, was there's an assumption that it was made back in the bad old days, and now we're looking at it in a different time. But are we? I mean, what is the era that we're in that makes this innocuous? Surely it's not innocuous, because we're still in the bad old days in some ways. But we will come back to this, because I think it's a bigger discussion around ethics. I just wanted to bring in Shaheen on the issue of both copyright, but also, Shaheen, you once said people are sometimes using archives to create rather than evaluate. And I wondered, in the discussion that we've begun to have with Ruurd, whether it's something that relates to that sort of situation. What is this this creation rather than evaluation, and what is the role of the archivist in making such decisions, or what is the role of the filmmaker in making such decisions?
No, there was. Thank you very much. There was a press release came out on eFlux from a museum in Seoul, which was looking both at architecture, design, and visual culture, and they suggested that the place of the archive for them was to gather pieces of the past and incorporate into a contemporary. And in the form of layers rather than just what it was. So the incorporation was really about layering the contemporary. And then they added for them to create a whole new narrative. And I think all of those things are really interesting, because we are going through a real break from the past, but we're very much interested in the past at a particular moment. And what is this impetus for this new narrative, and what are the technical and visualizations to make this new narrative? So I, of course, have watched mainly artists, and it was really interesting to talk about this idea of slowing down the film, because the 24-Hour Psycho by Douglas Gordon was one of the first times where you had to look at the image as a gesture. And in that sense, I'm interested in both how the filmmakers are coping, not only with the technology, but what the technology is doing to those images, and are they creating new narratives, or are they using it as raw material? And in terms of my own work as working with Panchayat was really about trying to come to terms with an invisibility which is problematic for us living and existing in Europe, especially in Britain at that time. And so in the 80s, we actually started collecting what was ephemera. And ephemera was the way of life for us because a lot of the times we didn't have material, we didn't have resources to produce a structure of materials which would last longer than a photocopier's life, or a piece of photocopied paper. Now, that material was what we considered to be the archive. And in that sense, the artist's CV was literally what is a catalogue for most people now, because that piece of paper said exactly where they'd been, and you could track and evaluate their position in society. So the CV for the artist at that particular point in the late 70s and 80s was a really important piece of document. It was the document through which they survived and performed. So again, we have the situation now that when the archive was given over to the Tate, who has it now, it was donated to the Tate recently, and it's been catalogued, a lot of the CVs had to be redacted, which means they had to be taken out of the archive and could not be shown because of the laws which are around private material and addresses and phone numbers or whatever, fax numbers. So part of the archive disappears in the process of how it becomes institutionalized or enters into the public realm. So at the moment we're going through this process of the Panchayat Archive becoming a special collection. And in the space of a few years' time, what was the identity of that archive has changed a great deal for it to be entering the public realm. And I think that also happens to be the case with a lot of the archives that people have dealt with. I feel, to a certain extent, that these archives have also changed. Much has been redacted. And what we're dealing with, to a large extent, is a redacted archive. So it's fragments of fragments, rather than just fragments.
Right. Well, it really begs the question about what archives can and can't do. What they can and can't do. Archives in themselves can't solve problems, or do they sometimes recreate the problems, which is, it's something that I know that both of you have had to think about and that continue to think about in this way. I mean, what's your view on it?
Well,
Do you want?
Well, I don't think it's especially recreating or rethinking about this period, but in this case, this collection we released is from 1944. So by showing it as a whole, as an authentic part of history, and I think maybe it was the first time that film was used in this way to change the way people think, or think about the way this propaganda was made. Made a big impression on people in those days. I think when we see it now, we see that parts of it are not correct. It is sort of a fake news machinery, and you see it more clearly now by what we know and by what we're surrounded with in these days of mass media consumption. And in those days, it was really different. And we thought it's more important to release this collection than to not do it and keep it for ourselves, or maybe deny it that it is there. And by making it available, it offers people to investigate this part of history. Mm-hmm. And we thought that is more important than not making it available. And what happens next, that's up to the people who work with this or do something with the material. But I think the first step is to make it available and to show that you have these materials, because it's not known. And archives are not always a place that people run to first to get their views on what's happening in the world, so to say.
Exactly. going back to the filmmakers, I mean, this, you know, if you come across material, the sort of material that Ruurd is talking about, in whichever context, I mean, what are your considerations about moving to that? I mean, Susanna has spoken a bit about it in relation to the Portuguese fascist archival material as well. But in terms of when you come across this material, you're in this position, how is it that how do you approach the archive, and what are the considerations that you have come across for getting access to the material? And can I ask also, what are your perspectives on giving your work to archives as well? Because, I mean, you're talking, in this moment we're talking about how you've used archives, but your work can and maybe at some stage going into an archive. And I wondered how what is your perspective on the interaction with archival institutions? And maybe you could also talk a bit about how you got the archives. I mean, what was that experience? Sorry.
Did you want to start? Would you want me? Or would you like? I'm happy.
A lot of
Sorry, it's
there's a lot of good questions there.
A number of questions, but choose whichever one.
I guess I'll briefly discuss it. I think the thing I've learned the most so far in just hearing everybody talk is, I think the way I see it is to not pretend that your film is some objective documentary film, and to essentially lean into its own subjectivity, to its own poeticization of the material, to its problematizing of its material. It seems to me that a lot of the problems come when the film is trying to be some sort of Olympian or pseudo-objective document. And just hearing everybody talk, especially June, just about how a lot of the strategy I fell into, approaching Marshawn Lynch, being told that he didn't care to participate, but when impeded, I could either have stopped making the film, I could have spoken to some of his acquaintances and colleagues, but a few of my previous books involved a lot of remix and repurposing. And so I fell into a process of finding just thousands of clips on the web and really leaning into my own subjectivity and, you know, and problematizing it and commenting upon it in this relatively meta way. I think that's just the one comment that I want to make that I've learned from everybody talking is just the excitement is to sort of double down on the film's subjectivity, and that might create its own problems, but at least isn't pretending to some sort of 30,000-foot perfectly objective view. Then you sort of own your own subjective lens. That seems to me absolutely key, I think.
Well, I can say something about I was very aware that most of the films that I used were not made for the purpose that I want to use it, because mostly they're made by male makers, white male makers, and so they have their own purpose to make it. And I can give one example that we have just wonderful fragments of Indonesian women working in the rice fields, and it looks like, oh, I want to be there, because, you know, it's warm, there are volcanoes in the back, and they're just in one line, and they're just having a good time, and they just pick a little bit of the rice. But I thought, yeah, but there's something, you know, this is something that they want to show it to us, this is great. And then I did a lot of research about how they worked in the rice fields, because for me the purpose was always the point of view of this young Indonesian woman. And then I discovered that at least it is very severe work, because they have to bow all the time, and they're in this mud. But also in those times you had the adat, and that means it's the kind of social rules that are in this society. And then they say, you know, a woman and children, they're not really working, they're just helping their family. So you don't have to pay them. And that was very good for the Dutch people, because they thought, oh, you know, we don't have to pay them, because they're just like it. They're just favoring their family. So they just get some rice, and that was it. So when I was using this image, first of all, I thought, oh, this is wonderful cinematic, it's great, and oh, I wish I was there. And then I did all this research, and so I tried also in like with the sounds that you hear the mud, and I hope you hear that it's not nice to be there day in, day out, and just working there, and also with the voiceover. So I'm perfectly aware that I make my own story, but it was made by, I want to tell the story of all these people that are in the shadow and nobody knows about them.
Okay. Yes, Susanna, and then we'll open up to the audience.
I just want to touch two points that were referred both. Yeah, Shaheen talked about the problem of the institutionalization of the materials, of the images, and the problem of the disappearance, something disappearing in the institution. And Ruurd, you talked about the availability, and of course that this is a huge problem regarding archives. And I have to say that I had lots of problems working with the archives, because not only because of the materials, but also because of the accessibility. It's always difficult to have access to everything that you want inside an archive. And regarding our works to be part of the archive, yes, I'm doing a lot of work. I'm working with former political prisoners. Now I'm working in Brazil in archives of neo-colonialism. So I have lots of materials that I think I will give to an archive. I don't know yet, but they constitute themselves an archive. And another thing that I just want to refer, it's the problem of the hidden images or the absence of images. Sometimes, and it's another thing that Sandra pointed, it's the problem of the production of the images. Who shot the images? For me, this is paramount in everything that I do. Yes. Who made this image? What is the original program? And when I said that I use the decelerated movement, it's not to turn the image, to change them. It's to try to go to see what is there apart from the original program, and to break the shackles of the narratives, the original narratives, so that you can see what is there. And another important thing, and I'm going to finish, is that, okay, I moved from the hidden archives of the Portuguese dictatorship to the neo-colonial archives of the Ford Motor Company. And this is a problem that I think we have to think also nowadays, because I was confronted in my last film that was made in Brazil with the over-circulation of the images. So the completely opposite thing that happened to me. I was searching for images that were not in the archives, and now I'm working with lots of images that over-circulated and are over-visible. And the problem of this over-visibility and this huge archive that is internet is that it erases lots of things. So this is another problem of this huge archive nowadays. So, but yeah.
Okay, we are going to open to the audience because I'm sure that you've been, have lots of comments or questions to ask, and I'd like that to happen. Okay, I'll come back to what I was going to say afterwards. Yes.
My comment is for the Dutch archivist. Sorry, I missed your name. I just want to say thank you so much for making an effort to do projects where you're releasing images and making them available to the public. I come from Australia and I just find it really hard to work with our national archives, even material that's out of copyright, they still want to charge a lot for. And I look at places like America where there is a lot of material that's available in the public domain. And I think it's really important because you end up having more analysis, more stories that critique history. And I think that for a country like ours, we're really suffering from that ability to be able to reflect on the past if you're not a public broadcaster. So my question is, would countries like the Netherlands be willing to advocate for countries around the world to do more projects like this, to release images, old images from the past that are out of copyright, to make them available to the public? Because I think, as you've been saying, I think it's so essential to be able to evaluate history so we can move forward and make better decisions.
Can I just say that it's happening there's a big campaign in South Africa to release all the apartheid era footage, and it's a big campaign taking place in South Africa at the moment. It's very topical, and it's something that they're trying to move to, that most people are trying to move to. They're trying to force the government to do that. So it is in discussion in a number of places.
I feel privileged that we can do this at
You got a
Vision in Holland.
microphone.
Yeah, I feel quite privileged that we can do this. We have this open mindset and we want to do this and make it available if we can. Of course, there's copyright, but then there's this ethical issue. Should we do it? It is public domain, but we don't want to be seen as spreading hatred or whatever. We just want to make it available and let people who know a lot about this material see it, watch it, and do things with it. So this was last year. We talked about this project on a conference, on a symposium, and that's where I met Natsuko Hayama. She's here. She's from NHK, NHK Enterprises, and now we're working together with her on this Japanese propaganda films. Part of it is in Sandra's documentary. And now we're taking a look at this collection. We have this collection. It was confiscated by the Dutch government in Indonesia in 1944, taken to Holland, and now it's all digitized. Well, almost everything is digitized. And we see that we have a quite open mindset towards this part of history that we're not proud of. And for instance, in Japan, it's a little bit more complicated. So to say. But now we're working on this project together. Natsuko from NHK is with Sound and Vision with us for 10 months. So we hope to make a documentary about this material and make it available and let people meet this collection and see it with their own eyes and be a judge of it themselves. And it's very nice that in Holland, again, that we have this open mindset, and our CEO as well thinks we have to do this. We have to make this material available and give it new relevance and make it important again, so to say.
Okay.
I mean, I like the fact that you're talking about openness, but I'm just a bit worried about how are you making it relevant to the climate which we're facing in Europe at the moment. In reality, there's an increase in racism. There's a rise of fascism. There's a rise of ethno-nationalism. So how is your archive actually making sure that it's working effectively to challenge these very difficult positions which places a lot of people who actually live in Holland from its colonies, who have to face these challenges on a daily basis? And in the absence of images, which we talked about recently, it's interesting that how much is regurgitated to suggest an openness to everything, yet there is an absence which endures and remains here. A lot of voices are not heard. So how is the archive working towards that?
Yeah, we thought about this, of course, but by releasing this collection, we don't think we actually contribute to spreading the right-wing thoughts or whatever. We just want to make it available and
but But is there not a wider responsibility, because you're assuming that it's going to be put out into a system where people have alternatives, that there are other perspectives or other views or other archives that balance it, which was the question, was what had been said earlier about once these archives are out there, that they can possibly release or encourage the release of other archives to challenge it. I think it was one of the things that you had said. But in the absence of other materials that might challenge it or that might provide a context for it or balance it in some way, isn't there a responsibility for the archive in that context?
Yeah.
Are you leaving it?
Yeah, we discussed it, but we think the freedom of expression to make it available, to put it online, to tell the stories about it, and put it into perspective of the time that it was being made of. We thought this was more important than the reasons why we should not make this available. So we have this responsibility, but we made this Q&A for ourselves, why the pros and the cons, and why should we do this? And we ended up with the thought that we should make this available, even though there are these doubts and these big questions, which are important, but we thought it's more important to make it available. That's maybe a short answer, but that's about it, I think.
Okay, I will come back to this question. I have something to say, but there's somebody at the back.
Yes, so that I sense that I'm not yet quite satisfied with the answer, to the extent that I'm wondering, just a plain question, in what way does the Beeld en Geluid, how does the archive integrate ethical questions, period? So not just this example that you are giving about the material from the Second World War, but in general, when it comes to the point that some groups will be affected differently than other groups by what you put out. So now the question is, do you realize that extended influence of the decisions you are making, and how do you go about weighing that?
Yeah.
Does the archive have a responsibility in that?
Yeah, sure, we do. Well, we did this together with the Netherlands Institute for War Documentation and Holocaust Studies here in Amsterdam at NIOD, and they had this World War II open data project in which they wanted to gather as much sources from World War II as possible. And they were working on this photo collection by the National Socialist Movement, about 800 photos. So they had initialized this project, and they had experience in releasing National Socialist papers about 10 years ago. And in those days, 10 years ago, there was a lot of oppression and a lot of news, and people were really negative about this. And now it's 10 years later, or last year, and they came up with these photo selection, which they wanted to make available, and then came to us, we have this film collection, so let's do this together. So we we made this point of view for ourselves, but we also did it together with them to see what is it now, why do we want to do it, what is the importance of releasing this collection. And we thought it's important to do this, even though there are these doubts and we might get real sharp questions. We thought the freedom of expression in this was more important than not to do it.
In theories of representation, archives, especially official archives, there are power relations. I mean, in terms of who decides what and when and how it is put out there, and also what the archives that are held in official, governmental, and your archive is a government archive, yes, an official government archive, what position they play. I have been in situations where we've been discussing archives, the role of archives and their position, where the archives come from, the role of official archives and the role of other archival sources. And it's always been discussed, and I think it is important to bear in mind that there are power relations in those different setups, because there's an assumption about official archives that they carry a certain amount of authority, and that, but those official archives are also looking at the other archives that you could say are on the periphery. It's this idea of a center and a periphery in terms of the relationships with archives. And very often what will happen is that the official central archive will open up to allow in the periphery, the material that's coming from the periphery, because it means that the official archives then contains or is able to maintain its control. It continually, and I mention this because it's something that was brought up by young people who want to use archives more and more. And they believe, they're feeling that, because when young people get hold of archives, they explore it, they interrogate it in a very different way. And that is what then gets co-opted back into the official archive. So, I mean, it's not an easy thing to understand, but if you think about how young people are appropriating archive in a digital sense and in other ways, and what they are trying to do with them, and then how that relates then to official archives. There is this idea of, what the relationship is and where the power relations are with those sort of archives, who is using them, who has the responsibility for them, and how you actually negotiate that, both as a young person wishing to work with archives, but also people who have a responsibility ethically for using archives.
I have this other question on the controversial material of the beeld en geluid. My question is, how do you publish this material? And question one, can I see it or can I copy it? Or must I negotiate with you? I'm a professional filmmaker. Normally we negotiate, we pay the price. Sometimes we get it for free, but always if we tell about the context we are using it in. And the third point, that was the man over there, Mr. Merali, was also, and more people were asking, isn't the archive also not responsible to put it already in context, the raw material? So that are my 3 points.
Is the archive the responsibility to provide a context, not just putting it out there for anybody to use it? Because And yeah,
Yeah, well, in this case, we made this collection available as public domain, and we put it online, and we donated it to Wikimedia. So there you can find these movies, and you can download it, and
use it however you wish
for your own. Yeah, you can do everything with it you want to. But on Wikimedia, we donated this to a certain category, and we provided context that this is material from this period, National Socialist
But suppose
movement.
then that, sorry to interrupt you,
oh, you're welcome.
that it will be used by right-wing movement to put a sort of perspective
Best of Anton
to
Mussert. Yeah, we thought about this,
Yeah.
but it didn't happen. But
it can happen.
It didn't happen yet, as we know it.
Can I just ask, who is we and who is for ourselves that you refer to?
We as Sound of Vision in the project together with the
And
Netherlands
who is that?
Institute for Sound of Vision.
Who is that?
As in persons, or?
Yes. How many of you are there?
Well, we did this with a group from NIOD, 4 people, and we did this at Sound of Vision with 4 people, with an external copyright lawyer. We have our own copyright lawyer, and someone else, and we talked about this thoroughly. So we came up, let's do this. But I understand that there are questions about this.
So I'm questioning.
But I don't think
now I'm asking the questions in terms of trying to ascertain. You're talking about for ourselves. You're talking about for we, and there's 10 of you, all right, including a lawyer, who is actually going against the process of denazification, as far as I can see it.
Well, yeah, I don't think so. No.
I'm just trying to address this because
yeah.
I'm just trying to work out what's going on here.
Especially when it relates to quite major ethical issues that will affect not only the Netherlands, it will affect, or it is affecting, many other countries at the moment. And it's a decision about...
Serious research concept instead of putting it out into the open?
But because that will be the alternative.
I mean, exactly. So I'm asking you, what is the alternative? Do you want to keep it all into the archives, very old-fashioned, like in Australia, for example,
and not talking
about it, nothing?
So that
there's a difference between people seeing it and people being able to use it in a particular way. So surely if they're going to be able to use it in a particular way,
so if
then
somebody donated
there is an ethical...
pedophilic images, would you agree to it being available online? If
it would be a sort of censorship not to talk about it or not to make it available online.
I'm sorry, but
so
Australia
that's
has
why
a
we
history
do
of
it.
being with the Netherlands, I think, in these issues.
Yes, definitely.
We should have started this discussion earlier.
Well, I, as a Dutch filmmaker, I encountered that we have to pay huge amounts, huge sums to Institute. 3,000 euros for a minute of archival footage. It is really not possible as a documentary filmmaker to make a good archive film unless you have a huge budget. Or you have to depend on public domain, but you want to have your best material, you want to have the material that speaks for your film. And still, also beeld en geluid, well, if you only make a film for the Dutch national television, then you can use the material and also you have to pay. But if you want, I think the rights and the money thing is key also in this question, and also for all the young people who want to kind of, remix, archive, or do whatever they like. It's something which needs to be addressed. So I'm sorry, it's not so good as you think.
I agree, but that's another discussion, I think. But I agree, yeah.
But it's not an either or. We're talking about different levels of responsibility. And, at what level is it a national discussion, or at what level can 4 people in a very powerful archive make that decision? I mean, surely there has to be a wider sense of what is going to happen with this, What level should it be made available? Of course, people should be able to see it, but can they just use it for however they wish to use it, however destructive that might be? And so, can 4 people make that decision? Is that sufficient? Or is it something that you would expect to have at least some level of public debate before it happens? Sorry, yes, go ahead.
I just wanted to comment that I think that it's, on the other hand, to put the responsibility on how to use that sort of material onto people deciding on whether it's available or not is not the right approach. Instead of thinking about, in general, education of people to change the state of mind, so you create a society with responsible people, I think that's a way more important part of the general discussion than talking about can those or those people use some sort of material, whatever it is. I think it's more the responsibility of the society in general to how to talk about this sort of topic, rather than we have to keep this kind of secret, or have to keep this in some sort of cupboard, so only people of whoever choosing then can look into that.
It's not either or. It's not an either or. And the position is not that it needs to be kept secret, is that you have to be careful how you release it. Of course, education about it is important. And if it's being released in that context, and for that to happen, then of course it makes sense to do it. And of course, if that is how it can work. But if it is being put out in a way while you haven't done, and of course for very much of what's happening in Europe and elsewhere at the moment, that educational work hasn't been done or isn't being done.
But then again, if you talk about that, there has to be discussion beforehand. Who's in the position to allow that sort of discussion, especially when you say that the political drive these days goes into a right-wing direction? Mm-hmm. Then it's even, would that make a difference then? That's the question I would then say. If you talk about European political movement into the right, and that mm-hmm. discussion would be, I assume, then be on that sort of level, then it wouldn't be really a difference there, would it be?
Are you saying that there isn't a possibility of having a balanced discussion at the moment?
No, but I'm saying
anywhere?
that...
There's no forums within Dutch society or any other European country's society to have a discussion or to have a voice about what should happen in those contexts?
Of course not, but just to say in general there should be a discussion is, I don't think, a proficient statement that you should also ask who would be in the position to do that sort of discussion.
Yes,
yeah, that's
definitely.
What I wanted to add.
No, I think you're right. There should be, but that isn't even being asked, is the issue. Sorry.
Hi, I have the question, or it's somewhat of a question, somewhat of a comment. Because we've been talking about archives, and very often we, in my opinion, misinterpret archives as being the one truth. Because we're talking like, oh, if we're putting it out without context, or even just with some context, for example, right-wing groups could then misinterpret and use it for propaganda purposes. But on the other hand, archives in and of itself, through the selection of material, is somewhat of a distorted, subjective view of the history anyway. Yeah. So the question would then be, who are we to say what is propaganda? Isn't that what we are doing, in a way, propaganda, or like contemplating over our history from a very one-sided perspective anyway? So that would have been my question to the filmmakers, especially, to get the archive a bit different focus now. Back to the filmmakers. So how do you approach a film to not fall into that trap of like becoming a propagandist in a way for the point you're trying to make? How do you try to keep the one truth, air quote, of course? Yeah.
we escape the trap of the...
Of your position becoming propaganda, I think is what he's saying. Was that it? How does the filmmaker prevent their position from becoming...
Yeah, actually, in my case, well, it's very particular because I'm working with archive footage from the fascist dictatorship, and with the materials produced by the political police. So my idea is exactly to show a kind of counter archive, so that to show what is not there in the archive, to show what the people don't talk about, and especially to work on the blind spots, something that it's not seen or heard. So for me, it's that's it. And when I was talking about this idea of over visibility, for instance, in my last film about a company town that was created in the middle of Amazonian for rainforest. The problem was that when we see what everybody talks about this small company town, is that it was the utopian project of Henry Ford. It's a ghost town nowadays, and if you are going to the internet, we see lots of images about this ghost town, about this utopian place, lots of images, archive footage that shows what Ford intended to do. And these are the images that we have. And when I arrived there, I was in an artistic residency to work on the place. And suddenly I realized that everybody talks about 17 years of the story, because it was the moment when Henry Ford was there. Nobody talks about what was there before. We don't have images, nor narratives, only mythological narratives, and nobody talks about what it is nowadays. So for me, as I told, the form shapes the content, and in my work I usually use this decelerated movement, and so I feel the necessity to change the methodology, and I instead use the acceleration of the archive footage, because it's not meant to be seen, because it's what people usually see. So the idea is to overcome the archive footage and to listen to the weak memories that nobody talks about. So this is the focus of my work. It's
a transformation.
Yeah, so it's to go to the blind spot. So I can never reproduce the big narratives and the narratives proposed by the archives themselves. So, yeah.
Thank you.
I'm sorry, I have to...
Yes. Thank you. Thank you so much, Susanna. I think we do have to finish now. I don't think there are any more urgent questions from the audience, but if there are anything that any of the filmmakers or you, Shaheen or Ruurd, would like to say at the end, any comment that you'd like to have?
Very, very briefly, in response to that very good final question, I would say that my approach is to let 1,000 discrepancies bloom. W.H. Auden says, great art is clear thinking about mixed feelings. And the thing I try to do is try to incorporate into the actual film a lot of counter voices, so much so that some people misread my film as being more critical of Marshawn Lynch than it actually is. So I think a good way to have one's film not fall into a sort of totalitarian perspective is to sort of allow the film to incorporate a panoply of different voices and not always be overtly commenting as to where the sand traps lie.
Right. Susanna's going to say something. Oh, you didn't want to? Okay. Yes, if it's a short. She'd like to show just 1 minute of images from the film. It's I've seen the film, and I do think there are all sorts of issues. I'd like to have a discussion with you, and I hope that the audience will get to see the whole film as well. But yes, let's.
It's one minute, but it's from this film where I accelerated the images. So,
yes.
But it's, I don't know if there is point to see them or... Because it's another...
Yes, people would like to see it, and I would like to see it.
Yeah, the form comes by necessity, never...
Is that possible, please? You know it? It's the second image for Susanna.
It's the continuity of the first one. It's just as, yeah, we have to change
Thank you. So that is an example of the transformation rather than just the repetition of the images with all of their intended, with their original problems, right? Of course, this is the beginning of a debate, really. I'm sure it will have other iterations, possibly within the festival, but also in the future. For us, well, for me, it's not the beginning of such a debate. We've had similar debates in London, in the UK, around archives and film. So, and each time the same basic issues need to be addressed. And I'm hoping that yeah, I'm sure it will echo in a lot of the other sessions that you'll be having here in the archive. And well done to IDFA for having this possibility of a discussion, and thank you to the filmmakers and to Shaheen and Ruurd for this. We will talk again, I'm sure, Ruurd. And you all. Thank you.